The morning sun cast long shadows across the United Nations building as massive silver ships appeared in the sky above New York City. People stopped in the streets, pointing upward at the enormous vessels that seemed to bend light around their edges. The ships moved with impossible grace, settling into perfect formation above the city without making a sound. Inside the UN Assembly Hall, world leaders sat in stunned silence as the main doors opened. A figure walked through that was clearly not human. Ambassador Kethmer stood nearly 8 feet tall, his skin a pale blue-white that seemed to glow softly in the artificial light. His movements were fluid and precise, each step calculated to project calm authority. "People of Earth," he began, his voice somehow speaking every language at once through small devices that had materialized on each delegate's desk. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in your world's history. We are the Nexari, representatives of the Unity Collective, and we come bearing gifts that will transform your civilization forever." Dr. Kim Hanna watched the broadcast from her cluttered office at Seoul National University. Books about ancient empires surrounded her desk, their pages filled with stories of conquest disguised as friendship. She had spent 20 years studying how empires rose and fell, and something about the alien ambassador's words made her stomach tighten with recognition. "We have watched your species for some time," Kethmer continued, gesturing to holographic displays that showed Earth's major cities. "You have shown remarkable potential, but you remain divided by conflict and limited by your technology. Offer you membership in a collective that spans 10,000 worlds, where war is unknown and suffering has been eliminated." The demonstration that followed left the assembly gasping. With a wave of his hand, Kethmer activated devices that healed a paralyzed diplomat, allowing him to walk for the first time in decades. Energy fields appeared that could provide unlimited power to entire cities. Medical scanners eliminated cancer cells instantly and painlessly. "All of this can be yours," the ambassador said with what might have been a smile. "All we ask is that you join us willingly, as partners in the greatest civilization the galaxy has ever known." In a secure military facility outside Washington, General Park Jin-woo studied satellite feeds of the alien ships. His analysts had been working around the clock to understand the visitors' capabilities. But what troubled him most wasn't their technology. It was their tactics. "Sir," one of his aides reported, "the ships position themselves over every major population center simultaneously. They're not just here to talk. They're making a statement about their capabilities." Jin-woo nodded grimly. He had studied military history his entire career, and the pattern was unmistakable. Throughout human history, superior forces had always made the same opening move when they wanted to avoid costly battles. They demonstrated overwhelming power, then offered generous terms. The Romans had done it. The Mongols had perfected it. Even modern superpowers used the same approach. "They're not invading," he told his staff. "They're negotiating from a position of absolute strength, but they want us to choose submission." Back in Seoul, Hannah pulled up her research on imperial expansion patterns. Every successful empire in human history had followed similar steps. First came the impressive display of power. Then generous offers of partnership and protection. Local leaders were showered with gifts and privileges. The conquered population was told they were joining something greater than themselves. The Romans promised civilization to barbarians, she whispered to herself, scanning through ancient texts. The British promised progress to their colonies. The Mongols promised protection to those who submitted without fighting. On her screen, world leaders were already beginning to debate acceptance of the Nexari offer. The benefits seemed incredible. Disease could be eliminated overnight. Energy problems would vanish. Humanity could join an advanced galactic civilization and leave behind the struggles that had defined their history. But Anna saw something else in the ambassador's presentation. The Nexari spoke of 10,000 worlds in their collective. Yet, Kethmer stood alone. Where were the representatives of these other species? Why wasn't this truly a joint delegation if the collective was really a partnership of equals? She opened her secure communication system and sent a message to her old friend Jin-woo. They had met years ago at a conference on asymmetric warfare, bonding over their shared interest in how smaller forces could resist larger ones. If anyone would understand her concerns, it would be him. "We need to talk," she wrote. "I've seen this pattern before in every empire that ever rose and fell on Earth. The promises, the demonstrations, the generous terms offered to avoid costly conquest. They're following a script that's thousands of years old. Within hours, delegations from major world powers were already drafting acceptance treaties. The promise of instant solutions to humanity's greatest problems was too tempting to resist. But in quiet corners of universities and military installations, a different conversation was beginning. Some people remembered that, throughout human history, no empire had ever conquered through generosity alone. Every offer of partnership had come with hidden costs, and every promise of protection had eventually become a demand for submission. The Nexari had made their opening move perfectly. But they had underestimated one crucial factor. Humanity had played this game before, not as the Empire, but as the conquered. And some humans still remembered how that story usually ended. The morning commute through New Seoul had become something from a science fiction. Dr. Lee Min-ho stepped onto a transport platform that lifted him smoothly into the air, carrying him through gleaming towers that seemed to twist impossibly toward the sky. Below, the old city remained, but it was now dwarfed by structures that defied everything humans had known about physics and engineering. 6 months had passed since Earth joined the Unity Collective, and the changes were everywhere. Children, who had been born with genetic diseases, now ran healthy through parks where gravity-controlled fountains created impossible water sculptures. Elderly people walked with the strength of youth, their bodies restored by Nexari medical technology that worked like magic. At the Nexari Human Research Center, Minho swiped his identification card and entered a laboratory that would have been unimaginable just months before. The equipment responded to thought patterns. Data flowed in three-dimensional displays, and experiments that would have taken years now completed in hours. "Good morning, Dr. Lee," said Velton, his Nexari advisor. The alien's voice was always calm and patient, like a teacher speaking to a promising student. "I trust you've reviewed the parameters for today's protein synthesis project?" Minho nodded, though something bothered him about the way every project seemed to have very specific boundaries. "I was wondering if we could explore some alternative approaches to the folding problem. I have some ideas that might lead to more efficient results." Velton's expression remained pleasant, but there was something final in his tone. "The current methodology has been proven effective across thousands of worlds, Dr. Lee. It would be inefficient to deviate from established protocols, Dr. Choi." Yuna, who worked at the next station, looked up from her display. "Minho, we're making discoveries that would have taken human science centuries to achieve. Why would we want to slow down progress with untested ideas?" But Minho had noticed the pattern over the past months. Every research project followed guidelines that had been developed somewhere else by someone else. Human creativity was welcomed, but only within very specific limits. Questions about those limits were politely redirected or simply ignored. In the basement archives of Seoul National University, Dr. Kim Hanna worked by lamplight, surrounded by books and documents that most people had forgotten existed. The Nexari had provided humanity with access to incredible databases of galactic knowledge, but they had shown little interest in Earth's own historical records. Hannah had spent months digging through these forgotten archives, and what she found made her hands shake as she turned each page. The Nexari had not lied about their empire spanning 10,000 worlds, but they had not mentioned what had happened to the original inhabitants of those worlds. The pattern was always the same. First came the generous gifts and technological improvements. Then came the helpful advisors who guided development along approved paths. Economic systems were gradually restructured to depend on Nexari resources and infrastructure. Political leaders found their authority slowly transferred to collective administrators who understood galactic affairs better than local officials. Finally, the original culture simply faded away. It's not through violence or force, but through a gradual process that made resistance seem pointless and independence impossible. The species survived, but everything that had made them unique was absorbed into the larger collective identity. "They're not conquerors," Hannah whispered to herself as she read accounts from worlds that had joined the collective centuries ago. "They're farmers. They cultivate civilizations until they're ready to harvest." In a secure meeting room beneath an old Seoul temple, General Park Jin-woo, addressed a small group of carefully selected individuals. They called themselves the Heritage Guard, and they had been meeting in secret for months while the rest of humanity celebrated their new prosperity. The Nexari made one mistake, Jinwoo told the assembled teachers, historians, and retired military officers. They studied our governments and our technology, but they never studied our people. They don't understand that we've been fighting empires for thousands of years. Kim Sora, a former resistance fighter who had spent decades studying guerrilla warfare, nodded in agreement. Every empire thinks they're different from the ones that came before, but they all follow the same patterns. The Romans thought they were bringing civilization. The British thought they were bringing progress. The Nexari think they're bringing unity. But we know how these stories end, added Lee Dong-soo, a historian who specialized in independence movements. Every empire eventually pushes too hard, demands too much, or simply grows too large to control. That's when the cracks appear. Hannah had joined the Heritage Guard after discovering that her research was being quietly restricted. Certain historical documents were becoming unavailable. Access to archives about successful resistance movements was being limited for security reasons. They're not just controlling our future, she explained to the group. They're controlling our past. They want us to forget that we ever knew how to resist, how to think independently, how to solve our own problems. The Heritage Guard had begun, creating hidden networks using methods that human resistance movements had perfected over centuries. They used old smuggling routes, ancient communication methods, and traditional meeting places that the Nexari had never bothered to study. While the rest of humanity enjoyed their new prosperity, a small group of people worked to preserve the knowledge that had made that prosperity possible in the first place. They remembered that throughout human history, the price of freedom had always been vigilance, and that the most dangerous empires were often the ones that conquered through kindness. The changes started so gradually that most people didn't notice them at first. Colonel Kim Woojin arrived at his military base one morning to find a new organizational chart posted on his office wall. His unit was now part of something called the Integrated Defense Structure, with Nexari advisors assigned to every level of command. It's just to help us coordinate better with galactic security protocols, explained Commander Ralmoth, an Nexari officer who had appeared seemingly overnight. Your expertise, combined with our experience, will make Earth's defenses more effective. But Woojin noticed that his authority to make independent decisions had quietly disappeared. Every order now required approval from the Nexari chain of command. When he tried to access certain military databases, he found his clearance had been mysteriously downgraded in downtown Seoul. News anchor Park Soo-jin sat in her studio preparing for the evening broadcast. For weeks, her equipment had been experiencing strange malfunctions. Stories about economic concerns or political disagreements with collective policies seemed to trigger technical failures that forced her to move to different topics. We're having some connectivity issues tonight, her producer told her through her earpiece. Maybe we should focus on the positive developments instead. The new medical centers, the improved transportation systems. Soo-jin had been a journalist for 15 years, and she recognized censorship when she saw it. But the restrictions were so subtle, so seemingly technical, that it was hard to prove they were intentional. Her complaints to network executives were met with polite concern and promises to investigate technical problems that never seemed to get fixed. At Seoul National University, Professor Lee Kyung found his course on political philosophy facing new requirements. A helpful Nexari advisor had suggested that certain historical topics might be unnecessarily divisive for students who were adapting to their new galactic citizenship. Perhaps we could focus more on successful integration. Examples, suggested the advisor, whose name was difficult for humans to pronounce. The students would benefit from understanding how unity creates prosperity, rather than dwelling on past conflicts. The protests began in small groups. Students gathered in Hongik University's courtyard holding signs that asked simple questions. Why can't we study our own history? Where did our elected officials go? The demonstrations were peaceful, more like academic discussions than political rallies. But the Nexari response was swift and efficient. Overnight, new buildings appeared in every major city. There were beautiful structures that seemed to glow with soft, calming light. Signs identified them as harmony centers, places where confused citizens could receive guidance about their role in the greater galactic community. Dr. Kim Jisoo had been one of the protest organizers. She was a former political activist who had spent years fighting for democratic reforms, and she recognized the signs of authoritarian control. When Nexari's security forces politely invited her to visit a Harmony Center for educational purposes, she knew she was in danger. "Dr. Kim," said the Nexari official, who escorted her to the center's entrance, "we understand you have concerns about recent policy changes. We're here to help you understand why these changes benefit everyone." But Jisoo never entered the Harmony Center. As she was led through Seoul's historic district, figures emerged from the shadows of ancient palace walls. In seconds, she was pulled into a hidden passage that led through tunnels beneath. The city that had been used by resistance fighters during the Japanese occupation decades earlier. "The Heritage Guard has been watching you," whispered Kim Tae-yoon, former military officer who had helped engineer her escape. "We've been preparing for this moment." In a hidden chamber beneath Gyeongbokgung Palace, Jisoo found herself in a meeting that could have taken place in any resistance movement throughout human history. The faces around her were tense, but determined, lit by candles that wouldn't show up on electronic surveillance. "They studied our governments," Jisoo told the assembled group, "but they never studied our people. They don't understand that we've been fighting empires for thousands of years." General Park Jin-woo stood at the front of the room, his expression grim but confident. "Every empire makes the same mistake. They assume that superior technology guarantees victory. But we've learned something that most galactic civilizations apparently never had to learn: how to fight when victory seems impossible." The Heritage Guard had been preparing for this moment since the Nexari first arrived, using communication methods that predated electronic surveillance. They had created networks based on successful resistance movements throughout human history. They used market sellers, taxi drivers, and street vendors to pass messages. They met in places that had historical significance, but seemed unimportant to alien observers. Within days, similar networks activated across the globe. In the mountains of Afghanistan, fighters who had resisted every empire from Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union began teaching their hard-won knowledge to a new generation. In the jungles of Vietnam, guerrilla tactics that had frustrated the world's most advanced militaries were adapted for use against galactic invaders. The Nexari had perfected their methods on species that had evolved in relative peace. Most galactic civilizations had never experienced the kind of constant conflict that had shaped human history. They had never needed to learn how to fight asymmetric warfare, to resist superior forces, or how to maintain hope when victory seemed impossible. But humanity had learned these lessons through centuries of struggle. And now, as the Nexari tightened their grip on Earth, they discovered that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. A species that had spent its entire history learning how to fight the impossible fight and win. 3 years had passed since the first Harmony Centers appeared, and the resistance had evolved from scattered protest groups into something the Nexari had never encountered before. In hidden workshops beneath Seoul's ancient markets, Dr. Oh Sungmin worked by the light of oil lamps, surrounded by pieces of captured Nexari technology that his team had carefully disassembled. "Look at this," he said to his assistant, Kim Nari, holding up a complex device that pulsed with blue energy. "Their weapons are incredible, but they depend on rare materials that can only be found on a few worlds. We can't build these, but we can build something else." Sungmin had learned his lessons from history. During the Vietnam War, fighters had defeated helicopters and tanks using simple traps and weapons made from everyday materials. Irish Republican Army had fought the British Empire with homemade explosives and bicycle parts. Afghan Mujahideen had destroyed Soviet armor using weapons that cost almost nothing to produce. "We're not trying to match their technology," he explained to his team of engineers and craftsmen. "We're trying to make it useless." The devices they created looked primitive compared to Nexar equipment, but they worked. Electromagnetic pulse generators built from old radio parts could disable alien surveillance systems. Simple mirrors and metal sheets could deflect their energy weapons. Most importantly, everything could be manufactured in basement workshops using materials that seemed completely harmless to Nexari's security scans. In her underground archive, Dr. Kim Hanna had become the Resistance's most valuable strategist. Research into historical resistance movements had revealed patterns that repeated across cultures and centuries. Every successful uprising followed similar stages, made similar mistakes, and succeeded for similar reasons. Taught us about cell structures, she explained to a gathering of regional commanders. The American Revolution showed us how to turn popular support into military advantage. The Korean independence movement demonstrated how to maintain hope during decades of occupation. But Hannah's greatest breakthrough came when she discovered that the Nexari's own communication networks could be used against them. Using quantum transmission systems that they had captured and modified, she began reaching out beyond Earth to other worlds in the collective. The first response came from a planet called Veltara, where a small group of survivors had been hiding in underground cities for over a century. They had almost forgotten their original language, but they remembered stories of freedom that their grandparents had told them. "We thought we were the only ones who remembered," came the message, translated through systems that the Nexari had built to connect their empire. They thought resistance was impossible. Within months, Hannah was in contact with hidden groups on dozens of worlds. Each species had different biology, different cultures, and different capabilities. But they all shared the same experience of gradual conquest disguised as generous partnership. Every empire falls the same way. She transmitted to liberation. Cells across the galaxy. They grow too large to control effectively. They become dependent on their subjects' cooperation. They forget that oppression always creates resistance, even when it takes generations to appear. The species that responded had never experienced the kind of constant warfare that had shaped human history. Their civilizations had developed in relative peace, which made them easy targets for Nexari integration. But it also meant they had forgotten something that humans had never been allowed to forget, that freedom was worth fighting for. No matter how hopeless the fight seemed, Ambassador Kethmer stood in his command center, staring at reports that made no sense according to everything the Nexari had learned about conquest. Human resistance should have collapsed after the first year. Instead, it was spreading to other worlds and inspiring species that had been peaceful members of the collective for centuries. Request additional security forces, he ordered his aide. Double the patrols. Increase surveillance on known resistance. Sympathizers. But the collective had never needed large military forces before. Their method of conquest relied on willing submission, not constant enforcement. The bureaucracy that managed 10,000 worlds had no procedures for dealing with widespread rebellion. On Earth, General Park Jin-woo coordinated resistance activities from a network of hidden bases connected by tunnels that had been built by smugglers and revolutionaries throughout Korean history. His forces used tactics that had been perfected by every underdog army that had ever faced a superior opponent. They have better weapons, he told his commanders during a strategy meeting held in a cave system that had sheltered partisans during the Japanese occupation. But we have something they don't understand. We know how to lose battles and still win wars. The Nexari had studied human government and technology, but they had never studied human psychology. They didn't understand that a species that had spent its entire history fighting impossible odds would see their galactic empire as just another challenge to overcome. In hidden workshops around the world, resistance fighters built weapons from scrap metal and farming equipment. In secret schools, teachers preserved human history and culture for future generations. In underground networks, ordinary people risked everything to maintain communication systems that the Nexari couldn't detect or control. The empire that had conquered 10,000 worlds was learning that humanity was different from every species they had encountered before. Humans had been forged in conflict, shaped by struggle, and defined by their refusal to accept defeat. And now, for the first time in their history, the Nexari were facing an enemy that understood the true cost of freedom and was willing to pay. The signal went out at exactly midnight Earth time, transmitted through hijacked Nexari communication networks to 47 worlds across the galaxy. Dr. Kim Hanna sat in her underground command center, watching as green lights appeared. On her star map, one by one, each light represented a world where species that had been silent for centuries were suddenly remembering how to say no.
Oh.
On the planet Kethval, creatures that looked like walking trees emerged from forests where they had been hiding for 200 years. Their ancestors had been poets and philosophers before the Nexari arrived, but they had been told that such activities were inefficient for galactic citizens. They sang ancient songs of freedom as they dismantled the monitoring stations that had watched them for generations. On the water world of Siltara, beings that breathed through gills rose from underwater cities that the Nexari had never known existed. They had been fishermen and explorers once, but the collective had assigned them to work in controlled environments, harvesting resources for the Empire. Now they reclaimed their oceans, using tactics that Dr. Hanna had shared with them from Earth's own naval resistance movements. Ambassador Kethmer stood in his flagship's command center, watching reports flood in from across the galaxy. Species that had been model citizens for centuries were suddenly acting like humans. They were organizing in small groups using primitive weapons and refusing to follow orders that had been obeyed without question for generations. "Is this possible?" he asked his aide, a younger Nexari who had never seen anything like this before. The integration protocols have never failed on this scale, but the protocols had been designed for species that had no experience with resistance. The Nexari had spent millennia perfecting their methods on civilizations that had evolved in peace. Cultures that had never needed to learn how to fight impossible odds or organize underground movements. On Earth, General Park Jin-woo led the final assault on Nexari installations around the globe. But his targets weren't military, they were symbolic. His forces struck at the gleaming towers that represented Nexari authority, the communication centers that maintained their control, and the administrative buildings where human compliance was managed. "We're not trying to destroy them," he explained to his commanders as they prepared for coordinated strikes across 6 continents. "We're trying to prove they can be destroyed. Once people see that their power is an illusion, the illusion disappears." Attacks began at dawn. In New York, resistance fighters used homemade electromagnetic weapons to disable the main Nexari administrative complex. In London, they collapsed a gravity-defying transport hub using techniques borrowed from World War II saboteurs. In Tokyo, they turned the aliens' own security systems against them, creating chaos that spread through the entire regional network. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Lee Minho, who had once worked in a Nexari research facility, had spent months learning their technology from the inside. He had discovered something that the resistance strategists had suspected, but never been able to prove. The Nexari were not the advanced beings they pretended to be. They're parasites, he broadcast across hijacked communication networks, his message reaching every world in the collective simultaneously. They don't create technology, they steal it from the species they conquer. Everything they've given us came from civilizations they destroyed centuries ago. The revelation spread like wildfire. Species across the galaxy began to recognize their own ancestral technologies in the devices the Nexari had claimed to have invented. The empire that had seemed so advanced was revealed to be nothing more than an efficient system for stealing and redistributing the creativity of others. The collapse happened faster than anyone had expected. The Nexari administrative system had been designed to manage willing subjects, not to fight simultaneous rebellions on dozens of worlds. Their small military forces, accustomed to dealing with isolated incidents, were overwhelmed by coordinated resistance that used tactics they had never encountered before. Within weeks, the collective's government structure crumbled. Nexari administrators abandoned their posts, communication networks failed, and the complex bureaucracy that had managed 10,000 worlds simply stopped functioning. Ambassador Kethmer sent one final transmission to Earth before his ship left the solar system. His voice carried a bewilderment that was almost human as he asked, "How did you know? How did you see what we couldn't?" Dr. Kim Hanna, now serving as Earth's representative to the emergency council that was forming to replace the collective, replied with the patience of someone who had spent years studying the same patterns over and over again. "We've been here before," she said simply. Empires rise, empires fall. The Romans thought they would last forever. So did the British, the Soviets, and every other empire in human history. You followed the same pattern they all followed, and you fell for the same reasons they all fell. The new Galactic Federation that emerged from the collective's collapse was built on principles that humanity had learned through centuries of struggle. True unity came not from submission to authority, but from voluntary cooperation between free peoples. Democracy was messy and inefficient, but it was the only system that could survive people who refused to surrender their freedom in the end. Humanity's greatest export to the galaxy wasn't technology or culture, it was the knowledge that no empire, no matter how powerful, could survive people who remembered what freedom meant and were willing to fight for it.